Well, thank you very much, Cassandra. It's good to see you again, and it's great to be here at the institute. It's an institute I've always admired. I haven't had a lot to do with over the years, but when Cassandra rang me, and I thought, yeah, the report should be out by then. I'll go and talk to them. At least they may be partially friendly. Well, the coverage has been quite extensive, I think, of the report. Some of it not particularly deep. And I'm sort of beginning to wonder that old expression, be careful of what you wish for. I'll give you a quick overview, and as Cassandra said, I'm happy to do Q&A. The key to our terms of reference, was very simple, very arithmetic, and I think quite brave on behalf of the government. And it was to get to a sustainable surplus of 1% of GDP by 23-24. A sustainable surplus of 1% of GDP by 23-24. And in some respects, that's not a huge surplus, quite modest. But I thought it was a good terms of reference given where we are today. And the other focus in the terms of reference was have a look, constrain yourself to expenditure, so there's no mention of the revenue side of the equation in our terms of reference. Have a good look at the Federation, and particularly VFI and HFI, and look at public service efficiency. And that's exactly what we did. So we're good people, we do what we're asked to do, but I think they were good terms of reference and relevant. On the expenditure side, the Commonwealth spends $409 billion a year. 95 billion of that goes to the states in GST or grants, tied and untied, and about 50 billion you'd regard as departmental expenditure, over which they have some flexibility. The balance, and which is the preponderance of it, of course, is really given in administrative programs, which are many cases legislated or contracted or what have you. So the flexibility is a lot less. And it's obviously, therefore, those are the ones that we did focus on. And we said, look, in going through those programs, we said, what are the 15 largest? What are how fast are they growing? And which ones are actually growing faster than the growth in the economy, or projected growth in the economy, and faster than certainly the Commonwealth tax take. And so those are the programs that we, in our Phase 1 report, really focused on, and no prizes for guessing what they were. They were areas such as aged care and aged pension, health, Medicare, hospitals, childcare, PPL, disability, defence, and what have you. So all of the things, all the main offenders that you would expect, and of course schools and higher education. We predicted, based on Treasury's projections, an increase in expenditure over the next 10 years of 280 billion, and 70% of that was taken up by those 15 biggest and fastest growing programs. In looking for the future, we based our whole report on what we thought was reasonable assumptions. We didn't assume the end of growth. In fact, we thought that we'd return to trend growth in GDP of 3% by 2016. Some may say that's optimistic, overly optimistic, because what we're really saying is we'll have 30 years of unbroken growth in Australia, and that would be unprecedented. I think the only country since the war that's had 30 years of unbroken growth has been Japan. So, again, we could be accused in our growth projections of actually being a bit optimistic. And everything else has been in accordance with what Treasury projects. We did assume also that bracket creep would be returned at some time in the next 10 years, because we found that low income or the people on the minimum wage would have a marginal tax rate of 32.5% unless that was corrected, and we felt that would be negative from the economy, apart from the impact on the individuals. We went right across all sectors of the economy. We tried to be as even-handed as we could. We certainly reduced or suggested a reduction in industry welfare, and That's certainly not made me terribly popular amongst a lot of my friends, but we did that on the basis of, well, if a program's not working, why should we be paying for it? So, we asked the question on the automotive and some of the other programs on Austrade and the Export Market Development Program. Well, what has been the impact? What's your KPIs, and have you achieved them? Dead cold silence. So, if you can't measure outcomes, why spend money on it? Was our philosophy. But we did say, though, if you cut industry welfare or business welfare, the government has an obligation on the other side to lower the cost of doing business. And hopefully they won't forget that in our recommendations. They must do their bit in deregulation, in labour market reform, in energy policy, and those sorts of things, and economic infrastructure in particular, to lower the cost of doing business. That's the other side of that formula. We suggested fiscal rules, very simple. Government tax take limited to 24% of GDP. We think that's a reasonable balance for Australia. It was the average between 2000 and the GFC. And if you don't put a cap on the size of government, then its growth is inexorable. A 1% surplus, we think, is a good target to have. We understand that will shift around over time depending upon the world economy and the local economy, but if you come back to a trend of 1% of GDP surplus, and ditto on the 24% tax take, sometimes that will go up and sometimes that will go down depending upon the economy. But we felt that it's good to have some simple, straightforward fiscal rules, and we've also suggested that the government come up with a fiscal strategy which is in line with those rules, and that my good friends in the ABC, we didn't recommend any direct cuts in the ABC. That we did suggest benchmarking against the private sector. Anyway, so we thought the rules, and we also suggested that the Parliamentary Budget Office be tasked with the job of checking the government's fiscal strategy and marking it off on an annual basis. It'll be interesting to see whether they take that up, but I think that would be a good discipline. We had a look at the efficiency of the public service, and as I said, there's not as much room to move there. I mean, if we could cut 10% off the $50 billion a year in departmental expenditure, it's $5 billion. All right, $5 billion's a lot of money, but it's not going to do anywhere near the heavy lifting that we're required to do to get to a surplus of 1% of GDP. But in looking across that, we found a number of areas where we think could be certainly improved. 900 bodies in the federal government. Heaven knows what they all do. We're not even sure whether it was 900 because there's no register. And that's got to be reduced significantly. This leads to duplication, waste, administrative cost, and I think policy confusion. And we're recommending a return to ministerial responsibility and in some cases departmental responsibility. We found that things like IT, the use of IT, the use of the net, digital economy, what have you, the Commonwealth was a long way behind the pace of the private sector in Australia and in the world, and that needed a special push, and it would probably need to bring in expertise to do that because it's not currently there within the public service itself. We thought that the corporate services side, the shared services, really needed to be worked on really hard. There could be considerable savings, particularly within clusters of sharing back office expenditure and services. We thought that the control of programs and grants was weak. Firstly, on programs, really no focus on outcomes, no focus on a yearly basis on are we achieving these outcomes and is this the best use of Commonwealth money. Indigenous was a great example for us. I mean, I think there's 100 Commonwealth Indigenous programs, and on virtually every indicator our Indigenous population is going back. So that's not working. That's not working. So let's get in there and make sure we're getting value for money out of these. And if the policies aren't working, don't be ashamed to say it. Say, well, we tried that, it didn't work, we're going to try something else. And ditto on grants. Grants are another case of that as well, where there's virtually no real measurement of outcomes on most of the programs. And on Indigenous, I found that of the 100 programs, we only found 10 had been, I think 10 had been reviewed, and 2 of them were satisfying their objectives. So one wonders why you would continue in that situation. We spoke extensively on the Federation. We think that that is a significant problem for Australia, and one that's been, say, heavily politicised and I don't think taken in some respects seriously enough, and I think it is a huge impediment to growth in Australia. We need to fix this up. The cost of duplication, the micromanagement from the Commonwealth. We got an example of an agreement between the Queensland government and the Commonwealth for 30 grand a year. 30 grand a year, an agreement. There's probably 4 public servants managing it. It's just ridiculous. I mean, this stuff has just got to stop. And we can't have 2 levels of government meddling in the same area. Pick one, go with the one that's, in our view, closest to the people, leave it with them. The other one, withdraw. So that is, I think, a massive issue. And the vertical fiscal imbalance and the horizontal fiscal imbalance have got to be sorted out as well. We've suggested that the GST base be broadened and that money go to the states and it be done on a per capita basis with the struggling states topped up out of general revenue, and I think that's a fair and transparent way of doing it. And we've also suggested, and people have regarded this as sort of very extreme, but it's not that really that extreme, is replacing some of the tide grants to the states with direct access to the income tax generated in their jurisdiction. Now, we've also suggested they could consider giving them some limited freedom to raise or lower rates, but that's an add-on option. But this would have the impact then of just ensuring that the states have less and less control out of Canberra, they are more responsible for their destiny, and they are rewarded if income in their state lifts, and they're punished if it falls. So I think that's a far more direct and sensible way of letting the states manage their own economies and managing their own futures. And after all, they are elected and they are rewarded or punished at the balance box every 3 or 4 years according to their performance. And they don't really need Canberra running everything they do. So I think that is something that we felt was really quite important to the overall welfare of the country. Just a couple of myths that came out of it that I'd quickly deal with. I mean, so this is a myth-buster segment. It's not a big business report. There were 3 former, very senior, respected civil servants, commissioners, 1 ex-politician and 1 business person. And this is a report of a commission. They are very independent people, very strong-willed. We had very willing discussions, I can assure you of that. So this is not a big business report, and this is not the Shepherd report. This is a report of a commission, 5 very independent commissioners. We didn't look at revenue because it is far beyond our remit and it's such a complicated issue that it would take a year to do that properly, and that's of course the purpose of the separate review. Although we did recommend increase the GST, reduce or have a very good look at superannuation tax concessions, and we did recommend abolition of the family tax benefit B, which in many cases is probably not a tax issue, it's a welfare issue. We did look at minimum wage, as I said, because we're worried about the long-term unemployed, particularly youth, and we felt a different rate in each jurisdiction would be recognising the economic reality of each state, and it probably would give the states with a lower minimum wage more competitive ability. We don't recommend dismantling the health system. All we're really saying is those that can afford to pay should pay for themselves. Co-payments, well, that's a measure to preserve the budget and also to reduce the risk of over-servicing when we are existing. I think the existing number of visits each year is 253 million. We did not concentrate just on the low-income earners. We said put the family home in the means test for the age pension and for the carers pension. That is not, that's not for low income earners above. That's the family home above a particular level, by the way. And we did say that should be eased in 15 years' time. Family tax benefit B going, that's another thing. Seniors health card means testing, that's another one for higher income earners. Deregulating pharmacies, that's another one for high income earners. Business welfare, that's another one for high income earners. And I think our reflections on super tax concessions also gives our view on that particular item. The last thing is, do we have a budget emergency? Well, in some respects, the House is not on fire. What we're trying to do is to get away from the hype and say, look, we have 6 years of deficit. We have another 10 years of deficit coming unless we do something about it. If we act now, act incrementally, do it fairly, bring the community with us, we can get back to a long-term sustainable surplus and have what traditionally has been a tradition. I think in Australia, the basis of our political economy has been a long-term sustainable surplus situation is always the most desirable place to be, because when you get into trouble, you've got capacity. So thank you. Very happy to take any questions.